Hi everyone, Maria here from Shep Earth Aware and from everybody at Shep and the Cork Environmental Forum. Welcome to this webinar in our Fridays for Earth series, our 9th webinar since we started. Information about both organisations is available for the Cork Environmental Forum. It's cef.ie. And if you want to be put on the mailing list of Shep Earth Aware, just send an email to shepearthaware@gmail.com. We send out a newsletter every month. Both CEF and Shep Earth Aware are active on social media. So this being 3 months, it seemed appropriate to have the webinar dedicated to the subject of trees. And in our correspondence, we advised people to watch that great documentary of Diane Beresford Kruger called The Call of the Forest, The Forgotten Wisdom of Trees. And if you haven't seen it, you can access it online or you can purchase it. It's very reasonable. And if you have seen the film, you will recognise one of our guest speakers tonight, Andrew St. Ledger of the Irish Woodland League, who featured in the documentary. I have to say that this talk has attracted the highest amount of people since we started the series. And there's just no doubt that when it comes to trees, people are really eager to talk and hear and ask, what can we do to increase the canopy of native trees in our towns, our cities and our countryside? And all across Cork City right now, there are numerous communities planting hundreds of native trees. It's great to see. For example, the Green Spine community in the north side of Cork City are planting. Trees Please, that organisation, have purchased thousands of trees and they're giving them out all across the city. So it's great to see this activity, and I'm sure there's lots more happening outside the city. We're really thrilled to have Andrew St. Ledger here tonight and Tony Lowes, Director of Friends of the Irish Environment. Both guests will be formally introduced shortly. I had the pleasure of ringing Andrew to book him for this evening's event, and we had a very long conversation. And I think I learned more in that hour and a half from listening to Andrew than I did in the last while. In a few moments, I'll hand you over to James O'Donovan, our moderator for the evening. But first, we'll look at a trailer for the film. And our speakers then will each present for 20 to 25 minutes, following which we'll have a question and answer session where we encourage you, the audience, to ask questions. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
A tree is not just a tree. Once upon a time, forests were considered to be sacred places.
I look around me, there are no oak forests left. There should be oak forests here.
While I was working with redwoods as a research species, I have to tell you, it's a pretty easy tree to fall in love with.
This is a perfect example of a city forest, the smallest forest in Tokyo.
It's not rocket science to put the forest back. Communities could be trained to engage in the restoration, in collecting the seed, creating the nurseries.
Our ancestors heard the call of the forest, and they heard the song of nature, the song of the power of nature, and they heard it through the trees. Now it's our chance to discover the forgotten wisdom of trees.
You're all very welcome to this talk. I'll start with an introduction to our first speaker. Andrew St. Ledger is a Dublin-born artist, wood sculptor, furniture maker and activist. And since 2002, he has been committed to restoring Ireland's native forests. With Ted Cook and Brendan Kelly, Andrew helped set up the Irish Woodland League, an NGO dedicated to restoring the relationship between people and their native woodlands in Ireland. He is a biodiversity officer with the Centre for Environmental Living and Training, who works in partnership with the Woodland League on forest projects. He is also active on the Clare Public Participation Network. Andrew is actively restoring native forest on his own land in Clare since 2007, and he drafted the first restoration proposal for the Great Forest of Aughty, a surrounding uphill area which is now being implemented. He continues to run workshops, give talks, visit schools promoting native forest restoration, while also working on his wood sculptures used for forest education purposes. Andrew's talks will be bookended by a couple of short videos. The first of those is called Climate Change, Fix Native Forests First, and the final one will be on a short one, an animation on the Great Forest of Aughty. So we'll start now with the Climate Change, Fix Native Forest First clip, and then Andrew will begin his presentation.
One of the earliest names of Ireland is Inishnaveoha, and that's Island of the Sacred Trees. It was known as a place where the people had a deep connection to woods and the forests. And because the native forests in Ireland suffered such complete devastation, less than 0.002% ancient woodland left, we feel it's in crisis. We don't exist without the healthy functioning forest ecosystems. We've forgotten to just be and to observe and connect, and we're rushing around, we're busy, technology has dragged us all over the place, while we're neglecting our home, the environment. This life support system we are taking for granted completely and failing to fully appreciate or understand how it's working for us. There is an integral value beyond money, beyond markets. It is essential for life. As Native Americans pointed out, when you've poisoned the last fish and destroyed the water and killed the land, you can't eat money. Money is not edible. Society would do well to look at the forest, because in man-made society everyone is competing for the other's place. Yet in the forest there is a cooperation at play and a society that has a harmony. Even in a dense forest, if you lay on the floor and look up, you will see the branches give each other space. We are running way out of time. The Forest in a Box project, it's a 1 square metre growing box for reproducing native forests. We're using seed energy, and we're using the forest floor. We want to connect children in particular to the forest directly. Their imagination is very, very active, and they're also not contaminated with the world. So there's a can-do attitude. They're full of imagination, and they get it, they really get it, and it is their future. And we're also connecting their teachers and hopefully their parents in the same process. And we looked at it as a really good opportunity to, one, create awareness, two, encourage community woodland creation and create a model that could be replicated. The idea of the box is that it enables, it empowers people to take responsibility at a local level. It is now up to you to be your own leader. You cannot wait for others. We must take responsibility and don't underestimate your ability to make an impact and to make a difference. And we must rebuild our communities.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. Just to say, James, the name of it, the film, was Change Climate, not Climate Change. And that's part of a campaign that we're running. You know, because, you know, climate change is so prevalent and in everybody's mind, but we thought we'd reverse climate change just in the title and play with words, but also emphasize that the most kind of cost effective and the most proactive way individuals can engage in doing something about climate change, which is a huge problem, is by planting trees, and particularly native trees. And in that way, you're helping to restore biodiversity. You're helping to take responsibility for your own carbon. If you help create a community woodland, you're going to help your community to, you know, take responsibility for climate change. So that's what that little film is about. I'll go to the presentation. Is that coming up on the screen? It's about the Great Forest of Ockley, and it's basically, you know, you're joining me for a walk in the woods, going through history, back a quick run through history. And then, you know, towards the end, we'll talk about solutions and ways that, you know, again, how we can change climate. The Great Forest of Ockley, which was the 1,000 years ago, was a 100 square mile forest, the forest of Brian Boru. It's just an overview of the presentation. And again, coming back to more recent times, Horace Plunkett, who founded the cooperative movement, produced a report. And basically that report led to the Department of Agriculture being set up in 1899 under English rule. But it also proposed a forestry plan that was to be developed in tandem with agriculture. Unfortunately, forestry and agriculture have been separated for too long. And at the time, that report was looking at an area of 3 million acres. And this is again before climate change or understanding biodiversity or, you know, the value of peatlands. So they would have been targeting peatlands there. But they're looking at the idea of creating a forest, basically to build up our economy, understanding that the foundation of a nation's economy can be based upon its wise use and management of its forests. And, you know, summing up the chief advantages of restoration, and they were, you know, quite visionary, talking about a shelter belt along the west coast. That can still be done to protect the land from the storms. The planting of mountains, restoring our uplands, looking at climate change, equalized rainfall and temperature, there was an understanding how trees are actually climate managers, prevent upland soils being washed away, talking about floods, silting. And the last one is very, very visionary. Report has just come out yesterday talking about agroforestry in the UK, research showing that introducing native trees onto forests reduces the need for pesticides. And there's over 100 years ago, it's in a report. The Forest of Ockley area is the red line, and it's I'm living up here in East Clare. To the right, you see the Lough Derg, one of the biggest inland lakes. And all the pink area is kind of mountainous land. And as I say, at one point, this was a huge forest, an oak forest. It was also known as the Forest of Sweden, which means sacred. And that was connected with Holy Island. Holy Island is one of the main islands off Scariff, Tuamgraney. And Holy Island was like Clonmacnoise. It was like the islands are where our universities were, the early pre-Christian and Christian, early Christian monasteries were actually universities of learning, where education was open to all. And there is a historical reference in the annals of the Four Masters of 16 ships coming up the Shannon, heading for Holy Island. This is in 800 AD, and the ships are from the Middle East. Some of them, they're from a variety of different places around Europe, and they're heading for Holy Island for the education, for the wisdom. A map showing forest cover in the 1600s. And that map, I'm looking for verification, but it's showing about 20, almost 1/4% of the land. It's probably late 1500s actually, but it's showing that there was still 1/4 of the country under primeval forest. And I should also say the authentic landscape of Ireland is Western Atlantic temperate rainforest. And, you know, going back to that time of the Great Forest of Ockley, you're looking at 65, 70% intact primeval forest, when Europe had lost most of its primeval forests. Ireland had preserved it. Because of its importance, we had a tree economy. There's 1,000 years of, again, linked to that wonderful history of education and knowledge, of a golden period of poetry, of learning, of a stable society, which, again, could only produce such works of knowledge and learning if, at a time when Europe was in the Dark Ages, they could only have such a stable society if they were managing their natural resources very well. And that means the forest in particular. This is a time before banks or supermarkets. This is the backbone of the economy. So by late 1500, we're down to quarter percent. The time of the report I spoke about, early 1900s, we're down to 1% tree cover on the whole island. The island is stripped. Again, coming back to that stable society, certainly there was warfare between the tribes, between the Tuatha, constant, but it wasn't huge warfare. It was more to do with, there was a warrior class. But basically, the glue that held the whole society together was in the Brehon laws. And under the Brehon Comai Kesa, the laws of neighborhood, it granted the rights in the forest to all. There's a list of what you could take. And again, it was all to do with not taking too much. It was about balance. And the trees, shrubs, bushes were divided into 4 groups of 7. The system of penalties existed for willful damage of trees, and it protected the forest for centuries, and also encouraged a respect. So the Breha Comai Kesa, that's the part of the list: the night's kindling, the cooking material, the nut gathering, the framework for vehicle, yoke, plough, timber for a carriage, for a corpse, shaft for a spear, wood for making barrels, butter churn, the wood for a butter churn, wood for an eklak, a horse rod, some kind of guiding rod for guiding horses, possibly in a chariot or in a, for oxen. And then something we've completely lost understanding of, every wood that wasn't subject to triple division, which again is a part of Brehon law that's been lost. Treneal good. The 4 groups, the forest was divided into 4: the nobles, the commoners, the lower orders, and the bushes. So the nobles are the most valuable: the oak, the ash, the holly, the apple, hazel, yew, and pine. The apple, even though it's not a big tree, apples were used for medicine, medical purposes, and they were revered. Hazel, the nuts as well, they're small trees. Holly was our hardest, probably our hardest hardwood, used for the shafts of, for spears, for shafts of carriages, shafts of chariots. Then the more common trees: alder, rowan, birch, hawthorn, willow, wild cherry, elm. These are trees that will also come back from being damaged easier. So the penalties were lower. And as you go down the lower, the shrub layer, you have the blackthorn, the elder, the spindle, the strawberry tree, arbutus, juniper, aspen, and whitebeam. And the lucifado, the bushes. So we've bracken, heather, gorse, bog myrtle, rushes, bramble. All of these are useful. They were used for dyes, different parts of them for dyes, for food, for medicine. And they're all listed, and they're all, again, it's showing more than possibly 2,000 years ago that there was an understanding of ecology, an understanding of the relationships between the plant, within the plant kingdom. Something we're coming back to again, thankfully, through ecology, which has made us, start to look at sustainable use of resources. And again, the realization that our natural resources are not infinite, they are finite. And again, in particular forestry, we have to start taking a holistic ecological approach to forest management. We can't just keep, the primacy of timber production and profit. That has to end. Our foresters need to be trained in a new way, where they, learn about ecology, learn about the relationships within the forest. That's missing hugely from the, tree farming industrial model that unfortunately was created on the back of the Horace Plunkett's plan. And I don't think it's what he had in mind. As I said earlier, a tree economy. We have a highly successful, stable society where there's learning in astrology, medicine, philosophy, the arts and crafts flourish. There's abundance of fish, birds. Again, because native woodland is the richest land-based habitat for biodiversity. So if we want to change climate and fix biodiversity, fix our native forest first. There's a list there which the historian Tacitus, the Roman historian, in the 2nd century, he writes about the trade with Ireland at that time. And it's he lists a list of what's being traded: skins, feathers, butter, beer, honey, pearl mussel. We also, you wonder why are the Romans trading butter? Why is the butter so desirable. Tacitus makes a point about the butter, that the Romans are mad for the Irish butter. And the reason is that the cattle are grazed in the forest. The butter and the milk will taste much nicer if the cattle are free range and they're feeding on the herbs, the herb layer in the forest. So everything about what their produce is much sweeter, much nicer. And pre-Christian times, the Druids, for the medicine, for herbs and for other uses, they asked the people to follow the animals, follow the cattle. They know where the best herbs are. Just again, briefly, the link with Brian Boru and the Great Forest of Octi. The Vikings are raiding at the time. The Boru leads a band of warriors from the Forest of Octi. They're living off the land. They have, it's recorded, they have wolf skin cloaks, and they're copying where the wolf sleeps between the roots of the oaks. Again, he's noted and noticed as a leader, and eventually becomes leader of the O'Briens when his brother is murdered by the Vikings, and eventually becomes High King, our last High King of Ireland. And that's the famous Brian Boru oak tree without its leaves on. Again, just a quick, around the 1601, the Gaelic order collapses. Richard Boyle, the Earl of Cork, he sells 20,000 acres of oak wood for 1 shilling per sound oak. He becomes the richest man in the United Kingdom. He's able to loan the royal family money. He buys the Octi Mountain and the Forest of Octi. And his family motto is, God's providence is my inheritance. And then a quote from Sir Jonah Barrington, not long after, trees are an excrescence provided by nature for the payment of debts. This is the attitude. Furnaces and forges then the 17th and 18th century. This is the final destruction of the forest. Cork was full of, you can see Clare as well, and Wicklow, and up north as well around Belfast. You see quite a, where those forges are where the last of the forests were, because charcoal, you know, was the energy for making iron. 25 tons of oak to make 2 tons of charcoal. A 74-gun naval ship required 4,000 tons of timber, 2,000 large oak trees. And there's a reference there, incredible what quantity of charcoal is consumed by one ironworks in a year. The iron industry in Ireland lasts for 100 years. It ends when there's no wood left, because there's no management, there's no law, there's no, basically destruction was being encouraged, and it went hand in hand with the colonization, and also basically the land was being tamed and turned into farmland. So as Spenser, the Elizabethan poet, so goodly woods fit for building of houses and ships, so commodiously as that if some princes in the world had them, they would soon hope to be lord over all the seas, and ere long of all the world. It wasn't long before the empire was lord of all the seas. Again, in 1870, we still had pockets of oak wood. That's up in Lochgill. W.B. Yeats' poems and poetry. The Hazelwood is close to there, that famous poem. A lot of what was these pockets that were left were destroyed during the Second World War by our own government. Well, we needed to trade for oil, we needed coal, and war creates an insatiable appetite for wood, timber. So 1939, export to the UK, Cool Park Woods felled 1939. So there was a second kind of catastrophe of our woods during the Second World War. Most of the sites were replanted with Sitka spruce. But just, I suppose, we need to also remember that the first massive catastrophe of felling was the biodiversity. That's the beginning of the main loss of biodiversity is linked to the loss of those woods. So it's like the biodiversity catastrophe happened. Again, up around the Great Forest of Uchtey in Derry Brine, the two farmers, that's 1947. It's a golden eagle they've shot. So there's still habitat, oak wood, and there's still enough wildwood in the Uchtey Mountains, or sorry, 1942, to support predators such as the eagle. And then Raheen Woods, 2015, the owner was persuaded by a project we had there. That's wild cherry. Some of the biggest wild cherry in the country is in Raheen. Specimen oak tree. He has about 60 acres of the ancient oak woods, and he's thankfully brought an extra 200 acres onto that. So about 260 acres of the estate, a 400-acre estate, are now being basically managed for restoration. It's probably the largest private native oak restoration in the country. And it was inspired by the work of the Woodland League and by CELT, the other organization I work with. And what we're looking to do is, again, to join the existing pockets of ancient and old native woodland in the Clare, Galway, in the Uchtey footprint. And that's what the plan is. But we also would like to see this happening in other parts of the country, that local communities look up the old maps and find the footprint of your ancient forest. And regarding, that just explains the Community Woodland Project, which inspired the owner of Raheen back in 2008, and that's Community Woodland. It's an immensely enjoyable local resource for people, for walking, for connecting with nature, and just a 4-acre site that was donated by the owner with a 100-year lease. So sometimes you don't have to buy the land if you can get a lease sometimes by a benevolent owner. It saves all the hassle of having to buy land. Slieve Uchtey botany study, again, of the remnant pockets of ancient oak wood. There's 150 hectares, which is the largest kind of contiguous, which is linked area of ancient woodland in the west of Ireland. The botanists are amazed at the richness of the botany. They've never been studied before. Gordon Darcy proposed the idea of restoring the oak woods. And we had also begun a journey of looking at the restoration of these amazing oak woods. And that just describes the process of working on a draft plan. We almost got funding for it proper, but otherwise it's been done in kind of small. Well, the largest part of it is the Raheen project, which is private, and are, again, individuals. Some of the Woodland League board have land within the footprint, and then other individuals are restoring their own lands. I have land in the Uchtey myself, and I'm actively restoring it. The townland names associated, because East Clare East Clare retained the language. It was kind of a wilderness for a long time. So the Irish language was spoken there till quite recently. So they retained their townland names, Oscuelga. And within that Uchtey footprint, you have over 50 place names with the word Derry, which is oak, telling us what used to be there. Context today is gone, But our plan is to link by the rivers, streams. We'll never have the whole forest back, but at the very least, if we can make corridors connecting the very valuable pockets, in that way we can create a network, a mosaic landscape of open land, peat land, and other valuable habitats will have to be obviously not forested. They're unique habitats in their own right and need to be protected as they are. But we see the value of, as I say, creating ecological corridors and creating a network within the footprint of the ancient forest, and trying to get local communities, local landowners, Coillte, National Parks Wildlife Service into a partnership to basically take pride in actually doing this. And again, the costs are minimal in comparison to money that's been spent on projects, supposedly for biodiversity, for environment protection. A small amount of funding would go a long way in creating these corridors, woodland corridors. And also, just to say that the ancient pockets of woodland, we cannot recreate the complexity of biodiversity that has evolved in those places. The relationships are ancient. But what we can do is create space to allow them to migrate, to allow that amazing complexity to walk along the riverbank, along the rivers, along the hedgerows, to give space for nature. We can fatten up the hedgerows, double up or triple up the planting, and create the conditions whereby that amazing complexity of biodiversity will move around and spread itself around and benefit everybody.
Can I give
I'm
you
probably
a time check
coming to
there,
the end
Andrew?
now, yeah.
Mhm.
Again, just to Drummond, one of those pockets, and we see an empty field in front where the farm is abandoned. And in that field, we have little oak trees coming up through the grass, but they won't make it. They'll be eaten by deer, by hares. The birch are coming up, the pioneers. But this all needs to be encouraged. Those, abandoned farms should be encouraged to allow the ancient woodlands expand into them. And that's, again, that's just got detail about the Raheen wood restoration, showing a thinning, a before and after. But yeah, it's, I don't know, I've probably said enough, and
Thanks very much, Andrew. So our next speaker is going to be Tony Lowes. Tony Lowes is an author and editor and director at Friends of the Irish Environment. Recognizing that European law was not being implemented in Ireland, Friends of the Irish Environment was set up in 1997 in order to be an independent advocate for the environment. They brought a legal challenge to the European Court of Justice in 2010, so looking to ensure that turf cutting would end on Ireland's protected bogs and that licensing and planning laws would apply to the unauthorised industrial peat extraction on raised midland bogs. It took a long time, but Bord na Móna this year announced the ending of industrial peat extraction and has started just initial steps on some restoration projects, although a lot is lost. In 2017, Friends of the Irish Environment lost its battle to stop a third runway at Dublin Airport, but they secured a significant change to Irish law. A right to an environment that is consistent with the human dignity and well-being of citizens at large is an essential condition for the fulfillment of all human rights, wrote High Court Justice Max Barrett in the decision on November 21st, 2017, which, despite ruling that the runway could proceed, created a newly acknowledged constitutional right to a healthy environment for Irish citizens. On the 31st of July 2020, Friends of the Irish Environment won their historic legal challenge, known as Climate Case Ireland, against the Irish government. The court's finding forced the Irish government to create a new and more ambitious national mitigation plan that complies with Ireland's national and international climate obligations, and we're all waiting to see what the climate bill is going to look like in the coming weeks. In his talk tonight, Tony Lowes asks if big carbon dioxide emitters can buy their way out of their climate debt, what kind of forestry we should be spending public money on, or is it better for the climate to close the gate and leave it alone? So I'll hand over to Tony Lowes now.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Andrew, that was a really nice talk. I think everybody values that. Now, there we go. Our first slide. Andrew's sort of shown us the good side of trees. I'm more here to warn you of the dark side, the traps in the language, the misunderstandings, the scams, and the fake profits that twist and turn every effort we make, undermining our genuine efforts to do our part to combat climate change and reverse biodiversity loss. So here's what we'll look at. Oop, I can't go back. We'll look at the biomass case that we took, the Court of Justice. We'll look at the carbon trap, carbon farming, and what forestry's place is, and the way of the future. Like most of us, I was brought up to think that an open wood fire was a good thing. The wood was being replanted, it had been seasoned, and it seemed as organic as one could find. It was in the Scandinavian countries that this alarm was first raised in the 1970s, as wood is widely used as a fuel there. In fact, it's exceptional in exceeding the national emissions from transportation sources. But the effects of inefficient wood burning technology, combined with a widespread lack of knowledge of proper fire-making practices, contributed to a growing concern about the impact of residential wood burning on air quality, particularly in urban areas. Complaints about smoke from domestic wood burning became more common after the energy crisis in the 1970s, when wood use increased sharply. But by 2011, climate alarm bells chimed in, particularly as the role of black carbon, the sooty part of particulate matter, produced through the incomplete combustion of biomass and fossil fuels in accelerating near-term climate change, became clear. These soot particles, when they're deposited onto snow and ice in the Arctic, lead to a reduction in the Earth's albedo. Albedo is the ratio of light reflected by a planet to that received by it. As the sun rises in the spring, the snow melt is increased because that black soot absorbs radiation rather than the white snow reflecting it. The snow begins to melt, and what they call positive feedback leads to further warming, exposure of bare sea ice, melting ponds, and with the continued melting, ocean water. Exposing the dark underlying surface leads to a decrease in the albedo, an increase in the absorption of solar energy, and further global warming. Negative feedback. So, ignoring warnings from scientists worldwide and its own advisors, the EU decided that a renewable energy policy that promotes the cutting and burning of forest wood as carbon neutral would be appropriate based on the ideas that trees will grow back. In fact, wood-fired power plants emit more CO2 per unit of energy generated than coal plants. But the Renewable Energy Directive, called RED, counts these emissions as zero. And of course, black carbon is nowhere considered. What has happened is increased harvesting pressure on forests in Europe and North America to meet the growing demand for woody biomass fuel in the EU. It will in fact result in increased CO2 emissions and the degradation of carbon sinks. New factories carved into wild woodlands, unprotected under law in the United States, in places like North Carolina, where 5 such factories have now sprung up to meet the EU demand. As defined in the directive, biomass produced from forestry can include whole trees, as well as secondary materials such as wood waste and forest residues. To meet these EU requirements, whole new treatment plants have been built. This is from a recent biomass magazine. Biomass, including wood chips, will be instrumental in helping the EU meet the new standard. Focused on opportunity, several US companies in a port in Maine are poised not only to take advantage, but also to demonstrate a technological advancement to wood chip processing and supplies. New England is home to an enormous wood basket. Maine alone is 90% forested and can sustainably supply more than 2 million tons of low-cost residue wood fiber. The EU is leading the world in finding ways to effectively use renewable energy to transition away from fossil fuels, and NEWS, Thomson Dyers, and PERC are working to help it reach its ambitious goals. So 6 of us went to the EU court. Hasso-Krüll from Estonia, now the 3rd largest wood pellet producer, where wide-scale industrial logging has destroyed dozens of treasured sacred sites, as some of the last remaining primeval forests of the continent fall to intensive logging, much of it illegal. Bernard Auric in France, where harm to their health and property values arose during the conversion of a nearby coal plant to biomass. Raul Kazan from Romania, where they face the destruction of some of the last natural forests in Europe. Peter Sabo in Slovakia is trying to end the logging, blighting the primeval forests of the Virlet Mountains, World Heritage sites, with the United Nations World Heritage Committee continuing to express its utmost concern. Kent Robertson, a North Carolinian, impacted by clear-cutting of the once biologically rich bottomland and hardwood forests around him. And myself, objecting to the use of biomass because it was extending the life of our peat-burning plants. So there were arguments. We cited the scientific evidence about the high emissions, about carbon stocks. We showed the market for wood fuels as a result of the EU's RED directive is so strong in some parts of Europe that producers were moving from residues towards whole trees, even high-value trees, specifically cut now for bioenergy. We demonstrated the illegal and unsustainable loss of forest. We showed how companies were felling natural forests in the US Southeast, where until now there was no market for hollow or gnarled trees. By converting the land to tree plantations, this allowed them to technically remain as forest and then exploit loopholes to qualify for Forest Stewardship Council certification. It would have been the first time that an NGO would have been granted standing before the court to challenge an EU law or regulation, but it did not happen. As with dozens of other cases taken by NGOs and individuals, the European Court of Justice refused standing, the right to bring a case before the courts, and the case went unheard. RED is in place, and the trees are still falling. A positive note, on February 25th, 2021, the Dutch government came together to reject future subsidies for biomass. 628 biomass installations in the Netherlands will not in future get some 11.4 billion euro in subsidies. So having dealt with the biomass myth, let's turn towards the use of forestry to offset carbon emissions. You know, the kind of thing, pay an extra €10 on the flight to Bahrain and the company will plant trees for you to suck up the carbon. Zero carbon, we're told, net zero, you know, carbon neutral, green energy, carbon offsetting. But does it work? Right now, companies, councils, countries are falling over themselves to declare that they're going to go net zero, removing as many emissions as they produce, with dates ranging from 2030 to 2050. Net zero doesn't mean they're actually going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to actual zero. It means they're going to reduce their emissions a lot or just a bit and fund an offsetting project to deal with the remaining emissions. Bingo, net zero. It's sort of like the indulgences were in the Middle Ages. We have sinned. We flew to New York for Christmas shopping, but it's okay because we paid extra to offset the emissions. It's called flight shame, and it's a term dating from 2017 by Staffan Lindberg, the Swedish singer, when he vowed to give up flying due to carbon emissions. Offsetting became mainstream when it was taken viral by Greta Thunberg. A further development from flagskam is taxskritt, a Swedish word that literally means train brag. People taking the train instead of flying post pictures from their trip, tagging them taxskritt. You can see here that there are even traveler's guides to buying your indulgences. But offsets, they're all kinds. We have our planting of trees, but they also go for gas capture projects that prevent emissions from reaching the atmosphere, clean energy development projects such as fossil fuels, and such as chlorine stations to treat water so it doesn't have to be boiled using fossil fuels. So the ideas are there. But when the United Nations had a look at this in 2016, they found that 3/4 of the projects were unlikely to have resulted in additional emissions reductions, meaning they would have gone ahead anyway. And only 2% had a high likelihood of being classed as additional. Why? Well, because there's already a strong demand for energy and a market that'll pay, because under the Paris climate change agreements, we've already made our pledges, because to be a viable offset, the carbon must be locked away for thousands of years. And tree planting or peatland restoration can't guarantee this. And of course, knocking down one area of forest may result in another area being dropped. The United Nations study found that emissions reductions are likely overestimated in 85% of the 7,700 offset projects to date, and 73% of the offsets available for 2013 to 2020 under the European Union's carbon trading scheme. And even when they work and actually do good, remember what Kate Irvin, the Associate Professor of International Development in Halifax, says, that offsets don't reduce emissions. It's about keeping things the same. So we have this coming home to roost in our data centers. Data centers are due to take 28% of the nation's powers by 2028, as companies compete with each other to take advantage of our lax regulatory environment. And these can be offset by, say, building wind farms. But unfortunately, that lax regulatory environment extends to assessment for proposed forestry as well. This is Meanbeg Bog at Donegal, where 183 acres of trees were felled to make way for wind turbines to offset Amazon's data center. The bog slide is one of a number, some of them very large and very damaging, that are beginning to occur as a result of the failure to properly assess the area they're going to work in. So you can get carbon credits with these offsets, and we can get them from the land and the way we use the land. These are the categories that the EU will give you credits for: managed cropland, managed grassland, afforestation, deforestation, managed forest, and after 2026, managed woodlands should also qualify. Croplands are estimated to be the largest source of the carbon that's lost because of the living organisms and their environment to the atmosphere. But the cropland estimate is the most uncertain of all the land use types. There are ways we could manage our croplands better: zero tillage, set-aside, perennial crops, deep rooting crops, more efficient use of organic amendments like animal manure and sewage sludge and cereal straw, improved rotations, irrigation, bioenergy crops, extensification, organic farming, and conversion of arable lands. But we don't see too many of those happening here in Ireland. This is what happens with grassland. If you give it to Teagasc, they do point out that, in fact, the silage and the hay production is not working, in our favor. They point out that there should be 5 years between the time your permanent pasture is changed. Well, that isn't really very long, because as they point out, cultivating the sward can result in soil disturbance, releasing carbon. Agricultural degraded land can, they say, remove atmospheric CO2 and sequester it as organic matter during natural succession. However, this process may be slow, requiring a century or longer to attain pre-agricultural soil carbon levels. I'm not sure that that's really an argument against it. And let's have a look what would happen if we were managing our grasslands properly. This chart shows you how the restoration of high plant diversity may greatly increase carbon capture and storage rates on degraded and abandoned agricultural land. That's a far cry from the monoculture pastures we have in Ireland. We have the largest proportion of land under grassland in Europe at 56%. The EU average is 20%. And across Europe, direct human management activities are simulated to have caused grasslands to switch from a sink to a source of greenhouse gases because of increased livestock numbers, overgrazing, and accelerated conversion of natural lands to pasture. If you look at this, you'll see that the late succession of grassland plant diversity leads to accumulating carbon storage that by the second period are 200% greater in the highest diversity treatment than if left by itself. Across the full time span, the highest diversity treatment stored 178% more carbon in the soil than did the monocultures, demonstrating the potentially large carbon stored advantage that the rapid restoration of high plant diversity may provide, something we've also learned in forestry. Forestry, deforestation, and managed forests. Well, there's no protection in any of these areas in what they call the LULUCE, the land use change in the EU terms, the EU regulations. None of them are required to ensure that their operations do not, in fact, degrade forest carbon stocks. And yet we're learning that this is much more important, much more urgent than we thought only a few years ago. Look at today's paper. This is Mary Donnelly, the new chairperson of the Climate Change Advisory Council, in today's papers, starkly outlining what Ireland faces. We have a steep mountain to climb and a challenge beyond compare when it comes to reducing emissions by 50% by the end of the decade. Quote, the challenge we're going to face in Ireland is going to be very significant. Just to give the headline figures, we're currently at about 60 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions. By 2030, we will need to get to 30. The current action plan, adopted in 2019, will save 16 of those. So we need another 14, which effectively means we will have to double our efforts vis-a-vis what we thought we were going to do to achieve our objective by 2030. So now the science says that the 2019 non-statutory plan introduces a stopgap after we succeeded in getting the Supreme Court to reject the National Mitigation Plan, under which emissions would have actually increased, will, 2 years later, have to be virtually doubled. The Green Party brought in a figure of an annual 7% reduction. we cited carbon briefs 15%, double the effort, what we thought we were going to have to do. And it turns out we will have to do by 2030. Irish forestry isn't all that great when it comes to the emissions. We grabbed the headlines in an initiative when I found this report produced for the Department of Agriculture. It's not entirely true of all forestry, but it's official. And we suspect that the amount of peaty soils drained for forestry were calculated, it would be much worse. I think commenting on the report, John Sweeney, the Menus Emeritus professor, really made a good point. He said, any hope that new afforestation can miraculously be counted to meet the short-term carbon budgets is misplaced. The present forestry model grows the wrong tree in the wrong place. We must not sacrifice biodiversity in Western Ireland to provide Sitka spruce plantations to enable biodiversity destruction on intensive dairy farms in Eastern Ireland. The report gives reasons for our forestry not acting as a carbon source, which you'll recognize. The level of deforestation, the increase of harvesting because of legacy planting, younger stands where the growth increment is not great, fire emissions, and the increased emissions from organic soils and non-CO2 emissions due to drainage associated with an increase in our forest lands. So don't plant peaty pod soils. Don't plant the uplands. Don't use alien species. Respect the fact that 80% of a forest carbon is in its soil. Scrap the national policy. Scrap Quilcher's commercial objective. Follow the pollinator plan. Shift scrub from cap to forestry. Incentivize agroforestry. Oh, and don't use hay bales as silt traps when you're doing your forestry. So this looks great. A good chart. Everything seems to be going up, but stop for a minute and have a look at two things with me before we finish up. Well, first, see how that green planting stops towards the end of 1999. Well, that was because Quilcher was collecting premiums as a farmer and using the guaranteed income to go to the bank, borrow some money, and go out there and buy more farms to convert to Sitka spruce. When I found this out, I sent a single email to the Agricultural Compliance Committee in 1998 of the EU, and that brought a stop and prevented Quilcher continuing this buying of the land and cost them 6 million in fines, confirmed by the European Court in 2002. In fact, Mary Coughlin and the department picked up the bill in 2006. Let's look at the real picture. That's the real picture. Caroline prepared this chart. Now it shows the targets in black and how they've always kind of been well out of line with what's actually achieved. But what's key here is what they call critical mass. That's the viability of the Irish forestry industry. And originally in 1996, when the forestry policy was initiated, that was 20,000 hectares. That's sufficient volume to enable the establishment of a sustainable value-added processing sector. As planting rates fell, each new report came out with another figure until it bottomed out with the most recent conclusion that afforestation at a level of 7,000 hectares is below the most modest targets. And in reality, it's not sufficient to sustain the sector into the future. And there you can see where we are, well below a sustainable forestry industry. I prefer this, as you do, scrub. We should shift this off from forestry grants, from agricultural grants into forestry grants, and leave it alone. One day it'll be a forest. And how are we going to do this? We're going to do it by telling them, because our politicians are not leaders, they're followers. And that's why mobilization is the key to change. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tony. So we have just a few questions for our speakers. For Andrew, this is maybe a difficult question. New trees are great, obviously, but how can we protect the trees we have when so many of them are being cut down for the most trivial of reasons by individuals, county and city councils, and the OPW? I don't know, Andrew, if you might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, at the beginning, I spoke about a campaign that we have called Change Climate, Fix Native Forests First. But the first priority is to protect what we have. And that's to prioritize the ancient woodlands and also semi-natural woodlands. Scrub, as Tony said, scrub is the first stages of natural regeneration. And all of those areas should be prioritized over and above new planting. But we need every avenue to restore our natural forests. You know, we need all hands on deck, and that's why, you know, individuals can do this. You know, it's communities can do it. You don't need scientists to advise you to plant a tree. You know, but you also need to look after it. So, you know, again, absolutely, we need standards. We need a new forest. We need a forest woodland culture to be recreated, you know, or restored. The main mission of the Woodland League is restoring the relationship between people, all people, and their native woodlands. That relationship is broken. That's the first step in reconnecting, you know, back a woodland culture, where our foresters are not being trained in woodland, in ecology. They're not, it's timber production, it's chemical use, it's exploitation of water, of soil, of other natural resources to grow timber at the expense of all else. If the forest model we have, well, a tree farming model, was examined under a cost-benefit analysis, and the damage to water, to soil, the carbon release that Tony highlighted from the drainage, the deep vertical drains, the flooding problems, the destruction of our fish, the health of our rivers has been destroyed. If all that was added up, we wouldn't be spending public money. We've spent over 1 billion euros since 1990 on a forestry, well, a fake forestry program that's going backwards. You know, the new planting required for that tree farming model, the minimum was 15,000 hectares per annum needed. 20,000 was to sustain an industry, as Tony highlighted. But you know, we're down, last year was 2,700 or 2,600 hectares. We're actually heading for deforestation because the rate of harvesting has increased. And Ireland is also looking to cash in on biomass. So they're going to be cutting more. They've already, Coillte are cutting younger trees. They're cutting, you know, calling it tinning to feed their MDF factories, which are run on biomass. Bord na Móna, now they can't use peat anymore, are looking at collecting the residues after clearfell to hoover that up and burn it, create a new business. The residues after clearfell are the only way that the land and the soil can get back some of the minerals and nutrients that have been sucked up. So by removing that forest floor, or the brash as it's called, it's completely leaving nothing for the soil to regenerate. So I'll leave it at that.
Perhaps Tony, and maybe we'll come back to you, Andrew, if you have some thoughts. How do we shift from a culture where it seems very easy for huge sums of money to go towards, you know, let's say subsidizing 1 million electric cars on the roads, but it seems very difficult to get money just to leave scrub alone and transition into native forests. You know, how do we get that understanding across?
I think it isn't just money, because the alternatives, some of the things that we're suggesting are certainly no more expensive, and in many cases, very much less expensive. I think it's this idea Andrew's mentioned of rebuilding the relationship between people and forests. And I think we've actually come a long way in the last 10 years, 15 years. I think people are, maybe partly because of COVID now, it's come up even more. People really have a relationship with nature, and they really have this relationship with trees. And this is what will make the difference. Because if we can get most of the people on our side, then we will get the politicians to do what we want. But they'll only do what will get them elected. And until we can make that change in people's minds, and everybody who's come to this evening here has the same idea in mind, I think, that we want this change. And there are so many ways to do it. In the early days, Andrew, we were outside the Doyle protesting about something like that. And the Minister of Agriculture actually came by, quite by accident, whoever he was at the time. And we said, you know, it's really bad for tourism. And he looked at us, yeah, we've never had a letter from a tourist. So even things like that can make a difference. Even letters to the paper can make a difference. Representations to councillors can make a difference. We have to get the voices speaking up so that people can hear, and then they'll listen, and then we'll bring about change.
Thanks, Tony. Andrew, perhaps you could comment a little on the culture and maybe also talk a little just about your Forest in a Box project and what it's like working with the children in the schools. It looked incredible.
Well, just on the culture, I mean, it's in early 1900, we had 1% tree cover. When that report by Horace Plunkett, you know, so, you know, the new state took on a policy that a program that had been started under London, direction of London. The UK were looking for fast growing conifers. It's connected to war, for mining, that you need pit props. And also there's a link with explosives from cellulose, from the fast-growing conifers. So globally, fast-growing conifers became of economic importance to the global powers. So we were, the model that was forced on Ireland was not of our own choice. When the new state took on the governance, it continued that policy. And in fairness, you know, it provided employment. It did, the Forest Service before Coillte were the managers of the public forest estate. And at least they did a bit of thinning. They mixed in some Scots pine. They mixed in European larch. They weren't as obsessed with monocultures. But you know, come the Second World War, the world is devastated. Ireland is, you know, reliant on an agricultural economy. We put our hand out for money under the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe. But the conditions are set by the Americans. The Americans are giving out free money, but the Americans are encouraging the tree farming model, this industrialized, you know, monoculture. It was called scientific forestry. So we were, again, trapped into the criteria attached to the loans, and the Marshall Plan was used for building up industry and agriculture. So we kind of got forced down a road that, again, in fairness to the people who were involved, they believed they were doing the right thing. They were, you know, putting trees on the land where there were no trees. There was social employment for farmers in the West in the winter time when they had no income. So there were positives, but we should have kind of grown out of it maybe by 1980 or, you know, before the free money came from Europe, that caused a whole other merry-go-round and an attraction to go for this helter-skelter. So again, we've a problem with our farms, that there was a disconnect between farming and forestry. Agriculture came out of the forest. The beginning of agriculture is from deforested land, rich, fertile soil. We need agroforestry. We need to combine forestry and agriculture. We need to bring the two back together. And again, I spoke about Tacitus talking about the Irish butter, because the animals were grazing, they were free ranging in the woodlands, in the forest. There was a mosaic landscape, there was open space farmland, but there was a deep connection to the forest. There was no separation. So it's the farmers we need to bring back. They have the land. We need to encourage them, and to take pride in having some mixed native woodland on their farms. There's an amazing project in England called the Pont Bryn, UK Pont Bryn, or Wales, 1,000 hectares, 10 farmers. They did it voluntarily. Only 5% of their land, the area, is targeted with mixed native woodlands. The results are astonishing, and it's encouraged them to want to plant more. But it's a mosaic landscape. It's impacted. There's less flooding in the area. They have more biodiversity. They're using the thinnings for bedding for their animals. They're saving money. They'd be sheep farmers. They're doing riparian planting. It's an amazing project, and we've put it in front of the government and the department many times as an example. And that's where we need to go. We need to work with farmers. And again, with scrub, scrub, it's not recognized as forest by the Forest Service. And then it's looked upon as a hindrance to farming by in the same building. The Department of Agriculture want the farmer to remove it. The Forest Service remit is to increase our forest cover. So the left hand of the department is fighting with the right hand. We need joined up thinking. We need vision. We need imagination. But we also, as Tony said, the way to get that is put pressure on politicians. Build up public pressure. And, I said we have a petition that has about 1,800 signatures and rising. We ran a campaign to stop the sale of quilcha. We got 50,000 signatures on a petition. That's the kind of figure that politicians get scared of. It's the equivalent of about three elected TDs, if I recall. A TD needs average about 15,000 votes to get elected. If a petition goes above 15,000 numbers, the politicians take notice because they might lose their seat. They start to think, okay, so if we can get up, to those 50,000 numbers, you put them under pressure. They start thinking the public awareness now has gone, beyond a tipping point. This becomes an issue.
You spoke about leasing land, Andrew. What can you say a little bit about that?
Well, no, I was just saying we don't always have to try and raise money to buy land. We can look to lease land. And through my work with Celts in the environmental pillar, trying to change forest policy, I proposed, and it's adopted by the pillar, which represents 28 NGOs, that we should have legislation like in Scotland. There's community woodland legislation, which basically targets failed state forestry commission plantations. Can be local communities can come together, form a cooperative, and they get assistance to buy. So it'd be like the quilcha, when they were being lined up for sale. The economist Colin McCarthy identified nearly half of about 500,000 acres were not commercially viable. A lot of that is in the hills. It could be leased by farmers. It could be local community cooperatives. Take it on with assistance from the state, with training. We need a forest standard that's ecologically and holistically focused. We need training. We need a training program that's, again, linked to holistic ecological thinking. and looks at the forest as an ecosystem, not as a cash crop or you know, a timber production factory. We can have timber production and people can make some profit, sure, but not at the expense of communities on their environment, or water, or fish, or, you know, there's no future in that. So we need to look at, again, just coming back to the difference between grassland and a natural occurring forest in terms of, just think of space, you know, space. A field of grass is a two-dimensional area. It's got limited biodiversity. Yes, within the soil is where most of the biodiversity and the carbon is, if it's healthy soil. But if you grow, or, you know, if you grow a natural forest in that, say, or compare a natural 1 acre of forest, you have a three-dimensional space. So every tree that now is becoming, like, when I'm coming back to the schools, talking to children, the forest in a box, I'd speak of native trees as being apartment blocks for nature. And they get it, they like it. You know, so I don't like using the comparison of concrete, but basically every niche in the native forest provides a huge area of habitat for a range of different species. That you have what's called the field layer, which is your ground layer where the soil is, which has a huge range of organisms. The next layer is the field layer, which has your herbs and plants. Then you have a shrub layer, which is a whole other area. Then you have your canopy layer. We have 4 layers that, again, attract and host a range of different organisms, different life forms. And those three-dimensional spaces, every nook and cranny, the older they get, the more valuable they become. And just coming back to the simple willow, you know, 266 insects associated with willow, 229 insects for birch, 1 birch tree. The oak tree is nearly, there's 286 or 84 insects associated with oak. But, you know, they used to think there was they were going up about 900 to 1,000 different organisms associated with oak. The recent UK Woodland Trust research is listing 2,300 species associated with oak. It's the climax vegetation in the plant kingdom. And about 268 of those species are what's called obligate species, meaning they only occur connected to oak. Like the gall wasp, for instance. That's how important, you know, and the older the oaks get, the more valuable they become.
And the more diversity is there.
The more diversity is there.
Tony, I'd like just to ask if you have any final thoughts, just as we're closing up now. Or are you covered?
No, I was just looking there at the chat, and
you saw that question. Yeah.
Suggesting that there is very little protection of the environment unless you go down the legal route. Obviously, that's an area that we've looked at, and the capacity for the sector. I think it's interesting, you know, we talk about the development, Andrew was talking about the development because of the Marshall Plan, and he used the term helter-skelter about the latest 1988 onwards. But in fact, it was a very carefully planned setup where Ray McSharry was at the time the EU agricultural, and he saw this money coming up, and they set up Quilcha in 1988 specifically to qualify for grants from the European Union. And then, having set the grants in place in 1993, 1994, Ray McSharry came back to Ireland and became chairman of Quilcha, receiving the money that he'd originally set up, while his wife, by the way, was getting a grant for forestry as a farmer. So what we're up against are large state-supported, carefully planned programs. Don't think it's random, and don't think it will be easy to deal with it. But we can do it really simply if we can get that change in people's minds right across the country. And as Andrew says, bring the farmers with us. Bring everybody with us, because until we do that, we won't get that change.
So I'd like to just thank everybody for coming along to our event this evening. I'd like to thank both our speakers very much for their time this evening and their expertise, Andrew St. Ledger and Tony Lowes. Cork Environmental Forum and Shep Earth Aware Friday Earth Films take place on the second Friday of the month. The next event will take place on the 9th of April, and it'll be a panel discussion around climate change. And so the information on that event will be sent out shortly. So there will be a follow-up email with the slides and information from both the speakers. So we hope that that will contain some of the information that was asked about in the chat. We'll also save some of the questions that weren't asked and try to address those also. So just to thank you all very much for your attendance, and have a lovely weekend.
Thank you, James, and everybody who helped organize this evening. It's really interesting.
Thank you very much for your time as well, and thank you for organising, lads. Well done,
Yeah.
Tony.
Thanks, Tony and Andrew. Brilliant.